By the third week of July 1944, the American First Army in Normandy had 12 divisions in the line. Almost 500,000 tons of supplies landed in 25 days, and command of the air on every day the weather allowed it. The German 7th Army in front of it was running on nothing. Between the 6th of June and the 11th of July, the German command in the west recorded losses of almost 2,000 officers and over 80,000 men. In the same period, it received 5,210 replacements. That is 6% of what it had lost. The armored division holding the ground the Americans wanted was Panzer Lehr. On paper, it was authorized almost 15,000 men. Its tank regiment, its 2 armored infantry regiments, and its tank destroyer battalion came to slightly more than 7,000 combat troops and over 200 tanks and tank destroyers at full strength. On the 24th of July, Panzer Lehr held its main line of resistance with about 2,200 combat troops and perhaps 45 serviceable armored vehicles. Against that, in 17 days, the First Army advanced about 7 miles. It cost roughly 40,000 casualties, 90% of them infantrymen. What stopped the best supplied army in the world was not the Panther, and it was not the 88mm gun. It was farmland. And the thing that finally moved it was scrap steel cut from German beach obstacles and welded onto the nose of a Sherman. First Army Ordnance made nearly 300 sets of it in 48 hours. The decider was the ground itself. The country inland from the invasion beaches is called the Bocage. It is farmland that has been divided and redivided by the same families for centuries, and every boundary between every field is an earth bank thrown up out of the ditch beside it. The banks are not uniform because nobody built them to a specification. Accounts of Norman hedgerows in 1944 give heights of anywhere from 3 to 12 feet and thicknesses from 1 foot to 4. Another set of measurements describes banks 8 to 10 feet wide at the base and 4 to 6 feet high. On top of the earth grows hawthorn, bramble, vine, and small trees, roots laced through the bank until the whole thing is a single mass, with the growth carrying the barrier as high as 15 feet in places. The fields those banks enclose are small. Averages given for the region run around 400 yards long by 200 yards wide. One aerial photograph of the Norman countryside, taken in 1944, shows roughly 3,900 hedged fields inside an area of less than 8 square miles. The lanes between the fields are older than the roads. Generations of carts and cattle have worn them below the level of the fields on either side, so a farm track is a trench with a wall of root and thorn standing over each shoulder. An army looking at that from the air sees pasture. An army standing in it sees several thousand separate walled rooms. American units in the Bocage stopped being assigned frontages in yards. They were assigned specific fields and specific hedgerows because yardage had stopped describing anything. Distances between formations shrank. 2 units separated by 1 hedgerow were frequently unaware of each other. Some tank crews found it necessary to appoint 1 man as a navigator because inside the lanes a driver could not tell which way he was pointing. One regimental commander put the method plainly: take one hedgerow at a time and clean it up. At that rate, often a single hedgerow in a day, the men said the war could last 20 years. The weather did not help. Cloud, wind, and rain across June and July of 1944 were heavier than anything recorded since 1900. The 9th Tactical Air Command flew over 900 missions for the First Army between the 26th of June and the 24th of July, and roughly half of the potential air support could not be flown at all because of the sky. Give the American side its full due here, because the mismatch in material was real and it was enormous. 4 infantry divisions and 4 armored divisions arrived on the continent during July alone, bringing the theater total to 22 American divisions. Almost 500,000 tons of supplies came into France in the first 25 days of the month, most of it over open beaches. When Operation Cobra was launched, the First Army had 4 corps, controlling 15 divisions on the Army front, with another infantry division and another armored division available and not yet in the line. Now the German ledger for the same weeks, taken from their own returns. Between the 6th of June and the 9th of July, the Germans in Normandy recorded the loss of 150 Mark IV tanks, 85 Panthers, and 15 Tigers. They also lost 167 75mm assault and anti-tank guns, and almost 30 88mm pieces. That is more equipment than it takes to fit out a complete armored division. Ammunition told the same story from a different angle. Around Caen on the 10th of July, against an estimated British expenditure of 80,000 artillery rounds, the Germans managed to fire 4,500 shells in reply. A German officer wrote that troop morale was good, but that they could not meet enemy material with courage alone. So the standard explanation is available, and it is wrong. The Germans did not hold Normandy for 6 weeks because their tanks were better. The tank comparison had in fact been flattened by the same terrain. The Tiger's 88mm gun and the Panther's 75mm gun could defeat American armor at 2,500 yards. The hedgerows removed exactly that advantage. Tanks in the Bocage generally engaged each other at between 150 and 400 yards. At those distances, the lighter, faster Sherman had a real advantage in handling. American crews knew it. By the 11th of July, the First Army Ordnance section had 36 captured or destroyed Mark IIIs and Mark IVs in its collecting points, along with 5 Mark Vs and Mark VIs. A tank destroyer crew watched 3 of its 3-inch armor-piercing rounds bounce off the front hull of a Panther at 200 yards, and then put a 4th round through the lower front plate, destroyed the tank. More and more medium tanks were arriving with the 76mm gun in place of the older 75. Every one of those advantages was available to the First Army in the first week of July. It still moved 7 miles in 17 days. What a bank did to a tank was mechanical, and it happened the same way every time. A Sherman weighing over 30 tons cannot go through a compacted earth bank 4 to 6 feet high with a century of root growth inside it. So it goes over. The nose climbs, the hull tilts back, and for several seconds at the top of the bank, the tank is a stationary object pointing at the sky. The main gun cannot depress far enough to engage anything in the field ahead. The whole machine gun is aimed at treetop, and the flat underside of the tank carries the thinnest armor on the vehicle because nothing is supposed to shoot at it. In the Bocage, it is presented to every weapon in the next field at a range of 200 yards or less. The Germans did not have to be clever about this. They only had to be waiting. German practice in the Bocage turned each field into a firing position and then tied the fields together. Machine guns were sighted in opposite corners of a field, so their fire crossed the middle of it, which meant infantry entering the field through a gap walked into two guns at once and could not suppress both. Mortars sat 1 or 2 fields back, behind the banks, where flat trajectory weapons could not reach them, and where their own fire dropped vertically into the walled rooms in front. Anti-tank guns and handheld anti-tank rocket teams covered the gaps and the sunken lanes, which were the only places a vehicle could pass without climbing. Positions were connected by field telephone wire laid along the banks. None of it required a tank. The result, in the official American account, was a continuous band of strongpoints in great depth across the entire front. The cost of attacking that is measurable, and it is worth being exact about it because the figures are what the spec sheets never show. The First Army's 40,000 July casualties fell overwhelmingly on the rifle companies. A rifle company, after a week of combat, often numbered under 100 men. In one regiment that had entered Normandy shortly after D-Day, only 4 lieutenants remained of all the infantry company officers by the 3rd week of July, and by then all 4 were commanding rifle companies. The 90th Division, less than 6 weeks after it was committed, had received enlisted infantry replacements amounting to more than 100% of its authorized strength, and infantry officer replacements of almost 150%. Its infantry had been replaced entirely. One tank battalion, after a single week of action, was reported not available for any employment whatsoever because of losses in personnel. And the open ground was not cheaper. East of Ken, where the country is rolling farmland and armor can actually maneuver, the British 8th Corps attacked on the 18th of July, advanced over 3 miles in little more than an hour behind heavy bombers, and then stalled. Over 3 days, that operation took roughly 34 square miles of ground and over 4,000 casualties. The tank figure for it is still argued over. The American official history puts British losses at 500 tanks, which would be more than a third of every British tank then on the continent, while modern counts of vehicles actually written off run nearer 250 to 400. Take the low number and the point still stands. Further attempts on the 20th of July cost 68 more tanks and 1,000 more casualties for very little ground. Open farmland east of Caen was not cheaper than the Bocage. It was only quicker to lose armor in. The Americans had already spent a month trying to solve the bank itself. The best answer available was the tank dozer, a Sherman with a bulldozer blade mounted on the front. Could cut a clean opening in a bank for everything behind it to drive through. It was also so new a development that there was a shortage of them in Normandy, and ordnance units began converting ordinary Shermans by bolting blades on. The blade had two problems. A dozer working on a bank is a large, slow target in a known place. German gunners understood that immediately. Stopping the dozer stopped the column. And some banks were simply too thick for a blade, so engineers with satchel charges had to open a hole first and let the dozer widen it afterwards. That was the other method. Combat engineers blew gaps with explosives. It worked, and it announced the exact spot of the next attack to everyone within 2 miles, and then the mortars arrived. Both methods shared the same defect, which had nothing to do with whether they worked. They took time. Because demolitions and dozer work were slow, tanks in the attack tended to stay on the roads and the sunken lanes, and the roads and the sunken lanes were precisely where the anti-tank guns had been sighted. The armor was being funneled into the one part of the terrain the defender had already ranged. So through July 1944, the American army in Normandy generated an extraordinary number of homemade answers, and the popular story keeps only one of them. As early as the 5th of July, the 79th Division had produced a device it called a hedge cutter, which ordnance personnel began welding onto the front of tanks. 5 days later, the 19th Corps demonstrated an arrangement called the salad fork. That one was an accident. The heavy prongs on the front were designed to bore holes in a bank so engineers could place demolition charges inside it. Somebody then discovered that the prongs would lift a section of bank like a fork and let the tank crash through the remainder. Men in the 5th Corps built 2 more, a brush cutter and something they called a green dozer. The 3rd Armored Division developed its own version, the Douglas device, with triangular plates on either side. Later, there were variants for the M10 tank destroyer, and the British Army's Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers produced their own prongs from captured German beach steel by the hundred. The version that reached Bradley belonged to a sergeant in the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron named Curtis Cullen. Cullen cut up steel scrap from a destroyed German roadblock and welded it into a set of tusk-like prongs across the bow of a tank. The prongs did the one thing every other approach had missed. They dug into the base of the bank and held the nose of the tank down, so the hull stayed level and drove a hole through the earth by force instead of climbing over the top of it. The belly never came up. The gun never pointed at the sky. The American official history describes the result. The tank went straight through a hedgerow, cutting through the earth and the growth laced into it and throwing brush up into the air, with the nose of the tank held down the whole way. General Bradley and members of his staff inspected it on the 14th of July. Now the part of this story that usually gets simplified into one man and one weld. Cullen received the Legion of Merit for the device. He was 29. 4 months later, in the Hurtgen forest, he lost a leg to a mine. The historian Max Hastings recorded that the original idea did not start with him. Cullen had been in a discussion about the hedgerows with a soldier named Roberts, who asked why they did not put saw teeth on the front of a tank and cut through the hedges. Cullen, by Hastings's account an honest man, tried to give Roberts the credit. It was ignored in the publicity that followed. What the record supports is narrower than the legend and more interesting than it. Cullen built and demonstrated the version that convinced an army group commander on a day when at least 4 other devices already existed inside the same army. Roberts, whoever he was, does not appear again in the record. The prongs were not one man's flash of genius. They were the shape a whole army's July had been converging on, and Cullen's was the set standing in front of Bradley on the 14th. Because the decision that mattered was Bradley's, and it was not a decision about a weld. It was a decision about production. Ordnance units on the continent were ordered to make the device in bulk, using scraps salvaged from the German underwater obstacles left on the invasion beaches. That detail is worth getting right because popular accounts credit the steel to Rommel's asparagus. Rommel's asparagus was something else. They were wooden poles planted upright in fields well inland to wreck glider landings, in numbers usually given as over 1 million. The cutter steel came from the beach barriers, the angle iron hedgehogs, and the heavy steel gate, which the Germans had positioned to stop the invasion, and which now went into the tanks that broke out of it. Bradley flew Colonel John Madaris, the Army Ordnance officer, to England to get the depots there producing tusks, to fit them to tanks before shipment, and to arrange air transport for extra arc welding equipment and specialist welding crews. The First Army supply staff cleared the welding rod out of every depot in England and carried across every pound they could lift. When a shortage of oxygen and acetylene cylinders appeared, cylinders were located across the United Kingdom and flown to Normandy overnight. In 48 hours, First Army Ordnance men made nearly 300 hedgerow cutters. Within a week, 3 out of every 5 tanks that were to be used in the breakthrough carried one. Tank destroyer units and self-propelled gun units asked for them too, and the First Army Ordnance section held the line on that, so the tanks were equipped first. In the 2nd Armored Division, roughly 3/4 of the Shermans, Stuarts, and M10s got a device fitted, and Bradley forbade anyone to use them until the offensive opened, because a tank that can leave the road is only a surprise once. The figures here do not fully agree with each other, and that should be said out loud. The official history gives 3 tanks in every 5. One museum account says the cutters were fitted to virtually every tank in the First Army. A commonly repeated production figure is about 500 devices, and one army account puts output at over 500 between the 14th and the 25th of July. 2 of those 3 claims can be reconciled, and the 3rd cannot. The arithmetic is not hard. First Army went into Cobra with 15 divisions on its front. An American armored division at strength carried something over 200 medium tanks, and a separate tank battalion carried around 50. 2 armored divisions plus the separate battalions supporting the infantry put roughly 900 medium tanks in that army. 3 in 5 of 900 is about 540, which lands almost exactly on the production figure. The claim of virtually every tank does not survive that arithmetic. 3 in 5 is the number to hold, and it is also the number the official history gives. The prongs alone would not have been enough, and the American Army knew it in July, which is why the rest of the machine went in at the same time. The most useful piece of it cost almost nothing. A tank commander in combat fights buttoned up. Inside a closed Sherman, he cannot hear a man shouting from 3 feet away. So the infantry squad walking behind the tank had no way to tell the crew about the anti-tank team in the corner of the next field. The fix is credited to Captain Edward Miller on the staff of the 743rd Tank Battalion. He proposed mounting a standard field telephone, the EE-8, inside a 30 caliber ammunition box bolted to the rear plate of the tank and wired into the tank's own intercom. An infantryman could then stand behind the armor, out of the line of fire, pick up a handset and talk to the crew. The proposal went to the 30th Infantry Division and forward to 5th Corps. At the other end of the scale, General Quesada of the 9th Tactical Air Command had very high-frequency aircraft radios installed in the tanks that were to lead the armored columns, so that pilots and tank commanders could speak to each other directly. That arrangement became the technique later known as armored column cover, and in August it worked better than anyone had planned for. What all of it added up to was a drill. A tank punches through the bank on the prongs. Infantry go through the hole with it rather than over the top. The infantry can talk to the tank from behind it, and the tank can talk to the aircraft above it. Engineers widen the gap for whatever comes next. An infantry commander in early July had complained that the tanks had not worked with his men before and did not know how to use the dynamite. By the 25th of July, that complaint had a procedure attached to it. Cobra opened on the 25th of July. Panzer Lehr held about 3 miles of front along the Perriers to Saint-Lô road with the strength already described. That was roughly 2,200 combat troops and perhaps 45 serviceable armored vehicles. Counting its attachments, about 3,200 combat effectives lay directly under the attack. By late afternoon on the first day, the German army commander in the sector counted 7 separate American penetrations of his line. Panzer Lehr lost the bulk of its remaining infantry, at least 14 assault guns, and 10 of the few tanks it had left, and its commander reported the division about to cease to exist as an organized formation. By nightfall on the 30th of July, the headquarters of the German Corps in the Cotentin and the forward command post of the 7th Army were both behind American lines. The last contact Army Group B had with its own troops on the west coast of the peninsula was a telephone relay crew in the town of Avranches, who came on the line to report that American troops were approaching. 7 miles in 17 days had become the base of the Cotentin Peninsula in 6 days. The device did not do that alone, and nobody serious has claimed it did. Cobra opened with a bombardment on a scale nothing in the Bocage fighting had seen. Panzer Lehr was already at roughly 1/7 of its authorized strength before a single bomb fell. German command had been feeding reserves into Normandy piecemeal for 6 weeks and had nothing assembled to seal a break. The American official history is blunter about the prongs than most retellings are. It records that the hedge cutter mattered a great deal for morale, because the hedgerows had become a bigger psychological obstacle than their actual defensive value justified. That is the honest reading, and it does not diminish the thing at all. Relocates it. The argument in Normandy was never Sherman against Panther. Gun for gun, the German tanks were better, and the record is not ambiguous about that, but the Bocage had already cancelled most of the advantage by pulling every engagement inside 400 yards. The argument was about which side could change its own equipment while the battle was running. One side identified a terrain problem in the second week of June and generated half a dozen competing field solutions through July. It picked one on the 14th. Inside about 10 days, it had 3 of every 5 tanks in an entire army converted, using the enemy's own beach steel and welding rod flown in from another country. The other side, over the same weeks, received replacements equal to 6% of the men it had already lost. No exchange rate is needed to compare those two numbers, and none exists that would be worth trusting anyway. The comparison is turnaround. 3 weeks against 6%. The tank that broke out of Normandy at the end of July was the same tank that had been stopped by a farm boundary at the start of it. Nothing about its armor changed. The gun was the same gun. What changed was that an army treated its own equipment as unfinished and had the welders, the steel, and the transport aircraft to act on that within a month of noticing. The side that can re-engineer its machines in the field in 3 weeks is not winning a tank argument. It is winning an engineering argument, and in Normandy, that turned out to be the one that decided how far you could go in a day.